Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf Kuf Yud Zayin. I want to first thank Rabbanit Shaval and Dr. Ayala Lipson for teaching my class the last 2 days while I was sick. As you can hear, my voice is getting better. I'm not fully there yet, but I'm able to teach, thank God, and get back to what we like to do. So I want to just remind everybody we have a siyum in just a few days. We are almost at the end. We have 3 more dapim left. We're going to learn on Thursday morning the regular daf for that day, which is the last daf of Bava Kamma, finish just before the end, and then at the siyum on Sunday night, Bezrat Hashem, or Sunday afternoon, or whatever time it is, Sunday morning by you, we will finish Bava Kamma together. Very last section. We have a great siyum lineup. I hope you'll all be there. I hope you all register on our website, right on the home page. There's a link to register. You'll get your own Zoom link, and it's a Zoom siyum, and we look forward to seeing you all there. We are going to get started now with the very top of our daf. So we ended, I'll go back a little. I know the previous class, they went a little farther, but I like to stick with the daf, so we'll start from the top of our daf. So we had this discussion. The Mishnah had said, when you turn over someone else's property, if you do it, let's say a thief comes and demands you give them, and you decide to, or there's a thief around, and you say, oh, by the way, here, why don't you take this, and you show them where someone's valuables are. So if by just showing them, the Mishnah says you're responsible. Okay, and then we said really it's, we want to know idina iknasa. Is that the law that you're responsible, or is it a penalty? So then Amar Le, so this was a question that Rav Yosef asked Rav Kahana, and he says, what's the difference, whether it's din or knas? To which he was answered, Rav Kahana answered him, idina gamrina mine, iknasa lo gamrina mine. If it's law, that we can learn from here to other cases. And what this really means is that what's going on here, and Rashi says this, where does he say? Gamrinan, we can learn here, Mehaima said Rav Nachman, Lishar Garmi Dinizikin Alma. This teaches you about other cases of Garmi. Garmi, if you remember, we've learned, is a kind of somewhere in between Gurama, at least according to most commentaries, Gurama, which is indirect damages, to direct damages, because it's somewhat direct. On the other hand, it's not really noticeable damages. It doesn't look any different. And you, in this case, right, that's what we're going to get to, a bunch of cases where you don't really see the damage, but it's also that you indirectly cause a loss to someone because you didn't steal it yourself, but you showed someone where it is and then they stole it. So that caused damage to someone else. So now we're going to say, so what's the difference? Well, if it's din, then we can learn from there. If it's knas, we can't derive anything from here. We can't learn anything about Garmi in general. We could just say they just penalized him here because they didn't want people to do this. So now they say, how do we know? And how do we know that we can't learn from a case of knas? That if it's knas, if it's penalty, well, then we can't necessarily learn from here to other similar cases. To which they answer, Ditanya. There's a braita that says, and it's a braita we've learned before in Masechet Gitin, when we learned about hezek she'eno nikar. But Rishonah hayu omrim, we've seen this other places as well. But Rishonah hayu omrim, amatameh v'menasech, chatzru lamar afa midameh. Originally, they said someone who causes someone else's property to be impure, someone's, let's say, truma, and they made it impure, and now it just has to be burned. Or minasech, someone who takes one's wine and offers it up as a libation to idols, that you're liable to pay damages. But later, they said even midameh, even someone who takes truma and mixes it with chulin, and now the whole pile has a doubt whether the whole thing is truma. The only thing you really can do with that is, since it's all potentially could be truma, you sell it to a Kohen for a much lower price because it's already going to be much lower than market price because there aren't too many people interested in that. So what do we derive from here? Well, chazru in, lo chazru lo. But ultimately, they didn't think that in the beginning, they didn't think that midamea was going to be liable. It was only later they decided to make it also liable, someone who's midamea. But why originally didn't they think so, right? These are all cases where the item looks exactly the same, but damages are done and it affects the value of it. My time mishum de knasu lo gamrina mine. Isn't it because it's knas and you can't derive anything from knas? And that's why they didn't think the midamea was liable in the beginning. The one who's midamea mixes the truma with the chulin is going to be liable. and only later they decided for whatever reason, yes, to which they say, no, that's not why. It's not because you don't learn from Knas. If it was Knas, you really could have learned from it. But Medameh is different from the other cases. Why? Well, originally they thought maybe we're only concerned for large damages. The hezek she'eno nikar, we're only going to make it liable if it's a lot of damage caused. But in a minor loss of money, like midamea, because you still can sell it. It's just you can only sell it for less money to a Kohen, but it's not as big a loss. And in the end, they said, well, in the end, they decided also for hefsei muat, even for a small amount of loss, we're still going to obligate the person who caused the damage, in which case this doesn't teach you at all what we wanted it to teach you. We thought originally that they're all the same, but then, and therefore you could have learned if one was a penalty, could have learned from the other. And the fact that we don't learn from one case to the other when it comes to penalties, right? Fines, knasot. So in the end, they said, well, no, that's not the reason. These cases, there was a reason to differentiate. But wait, we could still prove it further from another brayta very similar to this one, but with a different version. The father of Rabbi Avin had this version. This version has it the other way, which is the hefsei muah and the hefsei meruba go together. It was the mitame and the demea we thought were going to be liable, but the menaseh, we didn't think they were liable. And what do you see here? Chazru in lo chazru lo. It's only because they changed their minds later that the menaseh is going to be responsible. But before that, we weren't going to make the menaseh liable. Why not? My time. Is it not because we didn't learn from Knas, and we can't make the same distinction we made before? Hefsei meruba, hefsei muah, big loss, small loss, because that's not the case here, because you have big loss on both sides, the side where they did have the penalty and not have the penalty. So theoretically, you should have been able to learn from one to the other. This proves we don't learn Knas one from another. Look, not necessarily. We could say the same kind of answer we gave before. Mikara savre karabi av, levaself savre karabi Yirmiyah. Originally, they held like Rabbi Av, and then ultimately they changed their minds and held like Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now, we don't know what these opinions are. We're going to see right now. Mikara savre karabi av and dama Rabbi Av and zarak chetz mitchila arba lesof arba. Bekara shirayim ba'alichato patul sharei akirat zorach hanachai u'mitchayev b'nafsho. On Shabbat, when you do the action of carrying something 4 cubits in Rishut HaRabim, we've learned this many times, you need to, number one, uproot the item from its place and place it down somewhere else. Now, if that's the case, that there's 2 stages to it, if in the middle of your action, from the time you lifted it till the time it landed in its spot, it tears something, which is forbidden to, right, which is damaging someone else's property, while you're doing a malacha on Shabbat, you're going to be exempt, because the uprooting that happened before you hit, right, you uprooted it, then you threw it, this arrow, it shot through a piece of silk. When it damaged, and then it falls down outside of 4 cubits. That whole action is considered one action of carrying something in the public domain 4 cubits. And because you're liable, mitchayev b'nafsho, you get the death penalty for that, you're exempt from any payments. And how would that affect us here? Well, minasech, what happens? When you take someone else's wine and you offer it up as a libation to Avodah Zarah, well, you're chayav for Avodah Zarah when you do the nisuch, but you're actually liable for stealing it when you pick it up. So now the whole point is when you pick it up to do the libation, that's when you're chayav the gazela, but that is all part of the action of pouring the libation to the idols. Now, pouring libation to idols, you're actually liable the death penalty. So since you're lifting it in order to pour, that's all considered one action, just like the akira and hanacha is all one. And therefore, we thought you were exempt because of the din of kim levidiravamine. We don't make you liable for 2 punishments. You're actually liable for acquiring it from the moment you picked it up. That is considered independent from the moment you offered it up to idols. Those are 2 separate moments, and you're not going to actually be responsible, but they don't happen at the same time. We don't view it as you lifted it in order to pour it. No, you lifted it. A few seconds later, you poured it. Those are 2 different actions that happened at 2 different times. And therefore, you're liable for each one. And that's why we made you liable. So that was all part of our question. What is the relevance, whether it's din or kanas? We said the relevance is if it's law, then we will learn from here about dina de garmi. If it's knas, then we won't learn from here. And then we tried to prove, how do we know that if it's knas, we won't be able to learn? But there's no answer to that question. There's no proof because we tried two sources to prove it. We weren't able to prove from either source. Now we're going to start talking about all sorts of cases of a moser, of someone who gives over property of somebody else. Rav Huna bar Yehuda ikle leBe'av Yuni. Rav Huna bar Yehuda got to a place called Be'av Yuni. Atal kamei de Rava, came before Rava. Rav Huna, he says, Amar le kluma se ba'aliyadcha. You have any cases to tell me about? I want to learn. Amar le Yisrael she'ansu of dekol havim ve'haram among chavero ba'aliyadi. I had a case of a Jew that Gentiles came with a gunpoint, it was a gun or some sort of weapon, and forced him to give something. And he showed money of his friend. The guy put him up at gunpoint. He said, you want money? Fine. Here, there's some money. And he shows him his friends and not his own money. That baliyadi. I had a case like that. And I made the person who gave the money, told the Gentile where the stuff was, compensate the owner of that stuff. Amarle, Hadu Avada Lamare, Rav Huna bar Huda says to him, give that back right now. You took that money for really not the right reason. Ditanya, because it says in the Braita, Yisrael she'ansu of dekochavim. If a person was forced into this by the Gentiles, the haram among chavero, and then he shows his friends money, patur, he's actually exempt. The only time he's going to be liable is im natal v'natam b'yad chayav, unless he actually physically brought the money to the person, then he'll be liable. If he just showed where the money is, he's not liable. Why is that? Because he was forced. This is ones. In a case of ones, okay, garmi, we are not going to make you liable for garmi if it's ones. Okay, if you were forced into it. Now, you'd have to say that our Mishnah, when our Mishnah talks about if because of it was a gazlan, you have to give him another field, that's when there was a gazlan around looking to steal something. And you decided of your own, but small, you came on your own and you said, look over there. There's some money over there. And showed him, you showed the thief your friend's money. That would be, you come on your own and you do it, then you'll be responsible. But if someone puts you at gunpoint or someone forces you to give them something and you give the friends, that's okay. Now it's unclear. Commentary is exactly, if you're being forced to give the friends money, what if you have your own money and you can give them your own money instead? So we're going to see some cases like that where this issue comes up. And it's not clear cut which direction it goes in. It could be force means they forced to give you your friend's item. They said, we know your friend has money, tell us where it is. Or they forced you to give something and you kind of saved yourself by giving your friend's money instead of your own, which seems a little bit more unfair. But again, if you actually physically gave it to them and brought it to them, then you would be liable. This actually sounds like our Mishnah, and some people question this, like what's Rabba adding? But we'll just read it simply. Rabba says, if you showed it on your own, meaning the guy wasn't putting you up at gunpoint, but you came forward, guy was looking to steal something and you came forward and offered it, then it's as if you gave it by hand. Even if you just showed them and pointed them into where it is, you'd still be as if you actually physically handed it to them. Now we're going to have a case. So that was kind of just a discussion about this, a case that somebody had, but now we're going to start with other details of cases. So Gentiles came, put him at gunpoint. He showed him wine of Rav Meri, the son of Rav Pinchas, was the son of Rav Chis. So then, after he showed them where it is, they said, go bring it to us. In this case, what's going to happen? They're going to bring it by hand. So it was ones, which should exempt the person. On the other hand, the person brought it by hand. Excuse me. So darava amte bahadai. So the guy goes and brings it. So it comes before Rav Ashi, the case, and he exempts him. What this rabbis say, doesn't it say in a Braita? If you do it by hand and give it to them with your own hands, you're liable. That's an action, right? Again, garmi is where you cause something to happen. Here you actually physically brought it to them. So Amalahu, he says to him, well, it's not exactly the same thing. This is where when you give it to them by hand, that's when they're looking for something and you come and bring them something. And without you having brought it, they wouldn't have known. But in this case, He already told him where it was, and they could have gone themselves. And just because they asked him to do it because they were lazy, that doesn't make him any more responsible. Originally, he showed it to them. So because of that, he's exempt. And again, because again, he was forced, so therefore he showed them. And then when he actually physically brought it to them, that doesn't really count as physically bringing it because they could have done it on their own. Right? Because when he told him from the beginning, it was when he did bring it to them, it was already like it was burned. It was already lost. It was already a done deal because if he hadn't brought it, they would have taken it anyway. So that's why he's not liable. Let me read the words better. When they say, sorry, the case where we said is only if they didn't already know about it before. But if they knew about it before, he told them, then it was as if it was gone, it was burnt. But now Rabbi Yavau brings a question against this distinction Rav Ashi made about whether they knew about it before or didn't know about it before. Amar lo anas. Here's the source. If Amar lo anas, if the anas says, the thief says to him, Hoshili p'kiyam yerzeh, go bring me that bundle of wheat, grain, eshkol anavim zeh, or that bunch of grapes, v'hoshit lo chayav, and he goes and brings it, he's liable. Now, what do you see here? They already knew where the item was, and they just said to the guy, go bring it to me. According to Rav Ashi, the guy would have gotten it anyway without him, so he wasn't right. Again, it was just the person being lazy. So it's going to be responsible. How can you explain this? Well, this wasn't a case where the person could have gotten it on their own. This was a case where he was on the other side of the river and he said to the guy, go bring this to me. And then the only way the guy would have gotten it was because this Jewish person gave it to him. So that makes the Jew responsible. And also you can infer this because it says, Hoshit, pass me. They didn't say give me. If he had said give me, it would have been more obvious. Now there was two people who were arguing over a fishnet. This sounds like the beginning of Bamitzia. This one says it's mine, and this one says it's mine. Often, by the way, at the end of Masechtot, we have lead-ins to the next one, even though really it was all on Masechet. But clearly, we're getting a lead-in to the next chapter here, which is two people holding a talit. One says this is mine, the other one said this is mine, and they're fighting over it. So here, each one says that the fishnet is theirs. Now, the king's officer comes and tries to take it away from him. So he gives it to him. Okay, he gives him the item that's in question. Who's the owner? So theoretically, it could be owned by the other person, and then he's giving over his friend's item. Amar Abaye, Yachol Omar, Anaki Masri Didi Masri. You could say, listen, I just gave him my own. I believe this is mine, and I gave him mine. Can't make me liable for giving it to you. You don't have any proof it's yours. So tough luck. Amar Rava, Rava says, really? Rava doesn't agree. We don't know whose this is. It could be he really did give over his friend's item. And therefore, we put the person in nidoi until an excommunication, until they bring them to court and figure out whose this really was. And then once they can prove it, if the person is able to prove it's fully theirs, then they don't have to return anything back to the other person. Otherwise, they would. Another case. Sahu Gavra. From here, we're going to get to a very famous story of Rav Kahana and Rabbi Yochanan. So there was a person. He wanted to show, there were these thieves that came into town, and he wanted to show them where his friend's straw was. So he goes before Rav, Amalei, lo tichve velo tichve. You are not to show this thief where your friend's stuff is. Amarle, machvina u machvina. I will show him. I will show him. Okay, very disrespectful to Rav. Okay, why he came to Rav in the first place to ask if he wasn't going to listen to Rav is a really good question. But he says to Rav, no way, no how, I'm going to show him where my friend's stuff is. Well, Rav Kahana didn't like Siativ Rav Kahana Kameda Rav. Now he was sitting in front of Rav. Shamte lekoe mine, and he quickly takes something, smashes the guy's neck, breaks it, and kills him on the spot. It seems very harsh. All he was trying to do was give his friend's straw away, but is he deserving of the death penalty? Well, let's see what happens. So Kare Ravi Lave, Rav Kahana obviously had a very strong reaction. So Rav says about him, your sons fainted. They were lying the front of the city or something like that. Like, okay, some translate it as an antelope, perhaps a wild ox, which is trapped. Okay, so now what does this mean? Matozeh, this animal, once it falls into the trap, there's no mercy for it. And here was their approach about the Gentiles that they were living among in those days. Likewise, the money of the Jew. If this guy told him the straw of this Jew is over there, and they went and took the straw, the next thing they were going to do is kill the owner of the straw. Just like an animal that falls into a trap will basically be killed. Likewise, a person who falls into the trap, that once they take their money, they're going to end up killing them as well. And therefore, this person was a rodef. Basically, he was going to cause the death of the friend, and that's why Rav Kahana killed him, so that he wouldn't cause the death of his friend. And then, right, what's a rodef? A rodef is someone who's trying to kill somebody else. You're allowed to kill that person. And that's what happened here. But Rav continues and says, Rav says to him, Kahana, originally the Persians were ruling. They didn't care so much if somebody killed somebody else. They didn't bring people to court so much for that kind of stuff. Like, they kind of let it go. But now we're into the Greek world. By the way, some people have the reverse. There was the Greeks originally and then the Persians, which makes more sense. But anyway, to kaptu ashvichutamim, that they're very careful about shvichutamim, about people who die and bringing people to court for this. The amre mardin, and we're going to call you rebellious, or murderer. And therefore, kum sakla Israel, you better go and run away to Israel. Okay, and he basically says to him, this sounds very much, by the way, like the Moshe Rabbeinu story. Moshe was trying to bring justice, and he kills the Egyptian, and then he basically runs away because he knows that they're going to be out to kill him. So it's a very similar story, and then he goes and he reaches, right, he's treated with a lot of respect when he goes to Midian. So we're going to see a similar thing going on here. But he says to him the following thing, and this is what causes all the problems. Rav says to Rav Kahana, listen, you're going to go to Israel now, but, and this was, I believe, a scolding a bit of what Rav Kahana did, how he reacted very rashly, or immediate reaction without really thinking. He said, you have to, though, accept upon yourself that when you get to Rabbi Yochanan's yeshiva, you don't ask him questions for 7 years. We see later that Rav Kahana loved to ask questions and in a good way, but also a little much, right? The same way he reacted so harshly and quickly to this incident, also with his questions, sometimes it's a little bit much. So he said, you have to be quiet for 7 years. Don't ask questions. Okay, someone who, as you know, I lost my voice, and it's been very hard. I've been trying to save my voice and not speak. It's very hard not to speak, especially for someone who likes to talk a lot. It was hard not to teach. So it's the same idea. We're going to see how hard it is for Rav Kahana to stick to this condition that Rav basically said to him. Okay, you're going to have to be quiet for 7 years. No questions, nothing. So specifically with Rabbi Yochanan, okay? Now, you have to become scientific to the Yomi Rabbanit. Okay, Rish Lakish was the TA at the time, okay? The teacher assistant, he basically was reviewing the shiur with the students when Rav Kahana got there. And then I guess he must have gone off to the side. Amar lahu, Rish Lakish heicha. And he says to the students, where's Rish Lakish? Amrulei amai. They said, what? Amar lahu, haikush, I have a haikush. I have peruka, I have peruka. I have this question, I have that question, I have this answer, I have that answer. I have a lot to say. Okay, you see, person that didn't like to keep quiet. Amrulei Rish Lakish. So they said to Rish Lakish, wow, you got to hear what this guy said. This brilliant guy came to town. Now, Rish Lakish doesn't go meet him, which is just interesting. As a Rish Lakish, Amrulei Rabbi Yochanan Ari Alami Bavel. Rish Lakish, it's interesting, he kind of points out to Rabbi Yochanan, just like all these situations where having somebody points out, oh, look, there's my friend's stuff, there's my, right? So he says, listen, there's this Ari, this lion just came from Babylonia. Wow. Okay, you're going to be wowed by him, but he warns him also, you better study your stuff really well so you know you're on your toes tomorrow when you get to Shiur, because he's going to ask you some difficult questions. So they put him in the first row when he gets into the yeshiva in the morning, and the Beit Midrash put him in the first row. The first row is always for the most prominent people. Amar Shma Tavalo action. Shma Tavalo action. So Rabbi Yochanan teaches, he's waiting for the questions to come. No question. It's waiting for the questions, no question. They slowly move him back to back of 7 rows. In other words, they keep moving him back until he gets back 7 rows. Say, this guy, we thought he was something, but he's clearly nothing because he has nothing to say. Now, we all know why he's not talking, but they have no idea. Amar le Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Arisha, Amarta na'aseh shu'al. This is this line you thought of? He's a fox. He tricked us all. Okay, right? Foxes always dupe people. You know, he tricked us all, and basically he really doesn't have anything to it. He's not a smart guy at all. Amar yehe Rava dahane sheva dare lahave chiluf sheva shnim da'amar li Rav. Well, Rav Kahana was totally humiliated by this, and he said, you know what? This is why you could see he really couldn't keep quiet. He said those 7 rows that I got pushed back, you might notice the similarity of the 7. Well, so did Rav Kahana. And Rav Kahana said those 7 rows I got kicked back were like the 7 years I didn't ask any questions. That to me was felt like 7 years. And therefore, I'm going to open my mouth now. So Kamma kare, Amar le nahadamar beresh. So he gets up on his feet and he says, can you go back to the beginning of the Shiur? Amar shmatata va'akshe. So he starts, Rabbi Yochanan starts teaching and he starts questioning. They bring him all the way back to the front of the room, first row. Amar shmatata va'akshe. He continues to teach and he continues to ask questions. Rabbi Yochanan vayativ sheva bistar. Okay, he was sitting on 7 cushions, again the number 7. Each time Rav Kahana asked him a question he didn't have an answer for, they removed 1 cushion from under Rabbi Yochanan. Right? This is all the symbolic gesture of Rav Kahana rising and Rabbi Yochanan being lowered. Amar shmativ ekshe, he still asked questions. Rabbi Yochanan vayativ sheva bistarki, shafi lechad bistar kamitote. Sorry, I read that already. Amar shmativ ekshe le ad shafi lekulu bistar kamitote. He kept teaching, and Rav Kahana kept asking questions until they removed all 7 cushions from underneath him, until Rabbi Yochanan was sitting on the ground, which is already obviously pretty disrespectful. It was a kind of huge lowering of status. Rabbi Yochanan Gaber Sabahava, he was already old at this point, and his eyebrows were very long, and they drooped over his eyes, and he couldn't see. He said to them, can you please move them off to the side so that I can actually see this person? I want to see who this great person is. They used a silver brush and they moved the eyebrows away. He saw that his lip had a crack in it. Okay, but it looked like that Rav Kahana was grinning at him. So when he looked at Rav Kahana, he thought Rav Kahana was mocking him. Rabbi Yochanan felt really humiliated, and that caused the death in every good Talmudic story of Rav Kahana, because he caused Rabbi Yochanan to feel humiliated, even though it wasn't really his fault. Right? It was Rabbi Yochanan who felt the humiliation because he thought that Rav Kahana was mocking him. Okay, you see how, again, Rav Kahana gets himself into very dangerous territory. And you can understand why Rav didn't want him asking questions, because he saw how dangerous this could be. Rav kind of had almost like a prophecy about this, or just knew his student very well and knew that when you go to a new place and you start, acting the way you act, that kind of puts people in a certain, right, makes them feel very uncomfortable. And he didn't want that to happen. That's why he said, wait 7 years. By that point, they'll know you, they'll understand where it's coming from. Well, the story doesn't end here though. And even though Rav Kahana died, let's see what happened. So Rabbi Yochanan says the next day the rabbis, guess he was feeling bad that he killed the guy, said, it's interesting. We start the story with Rav Kahana killing someone who was a rodef, and then we end up with Rabbi Yochanan killing Rav Kahana, who was doing something also that was kind of ruining Rabbi Yochanan's standing in the Beit Midrash. So he said, did you see how that Babylonian acted? Amrulei darkei hachi. What do you mean? He wasn't grinning at you. That's just his way. And I think here there's a double meaning. It's not just the way he was looking at him, his lip was cracked and he thought he was grinning, but also his way of asking questions. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan was saying, this guy was totally disrespectful to me. And they said, no, that's just his way. It's his nature. Some people ask questions in that kind of way. They mean it in a genuine way. It just comes off sounding a little rough and tough and mean or arrogant, but he didn't mean it that way. So Rabbi Yochanan feels really bad. He goes to the burial cave where Rav Kahana is buried. Chaza dahu hadrale achna. He saw that there was a snake wrapped around, okay, with his mouth and his face. And, he was totally covering up the whole round hole of the entranceway of the cave. Amar le, achna, achna, pach pumech, ptach pumech. Snake, snake, open your mouth. V'yikanes harav et talmid. Me, the rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan, I want to go visit my talmid, my student. Please open up. V'lo patach, but he wouldn't. Yikanes chaver etzel chaver. So he changes his language. He says, fine. A colleague to a colleague. Okay, fine. Maybe I wasn't the rabbi and he isn't the student of mine. He's already at the same level as me. So let the chaver etzel chaver. V'lo patach. He wouldn't open it. Yikanes talmid etzel harav. He says, fine. I'll try this one. The student, can you let the student go in for the rabbi? And once he saw that Rabbi Yochanan had that level of respect for Rav Kahana, patach, the snake opens the door for him. By rachame va'okme. Now, Rav Yochanan prays for Rav Kahana, and he actually comes back to life. Okay, we'll make another comparison of this story to the story of, in Megillah, if you recall, it was a famous story where Rabbi and Rabbi Eliezer do a purim suda together, and then one kills the other, and then they ask for rachamim, and they bring him back to life. Okay, and then the other guy invites him the next year again to the purim suda, and he says, no, I got killed once in your house. I don't rely on a miracle twice. So this is kind of going to be a similar story where someone dies, comes back to life, but then sort of is a little nervous about the next stage. So let's see. Amar le. Rabbi Yochanan said, had I known that this was your way, meaning, right, again, your lip was cracked and it wasn't that you were smirking at me, or also that this was your just way of learning Torah by asking harsh questions, I wouldn't have gotten so humiliated, and then you wouldn't have died. Why don't you come back and learn with me? Okay, this is where I said, Rav Kahana is going to be a little bit nervous about doing this. Amar le. If you manage to ask for mercy that I won't die again, okay, which he really means, the way I understand, is not I'll never die. Obviously, people die. But, make sure that we don't get into the same kind of situation. You won't get angry at me anymore, and you'll understand my way. Aziona, then I'll go with you. Ve'ilo, but if not, lo aziona. I'm not going to go because it's too dangerous. Okay, there's different ways of understanding this, but perhaps it's the continuation of what he's saying. Since I already had my time. In other words, I got brought back to life. I don't think that's going to happen again. So Tayre Okme. So he wakes him up entirely. I guess he was only half alive at this point. And he lifts him up, stands him up, and they go back to the Beit Midrash. Shaila Kosveka Dehavile. So Rabbi Yochanan asks all the questions that he didn't have answers to. Upashine Niale. And Rav Kahana answers all his questions. Hainu Amar Rabbi Yochanan. And this is where Rabbi Yochanan said, Dilchon Amre. I used to say that ours were the best. In Israel, we had the best rabbis. We knew everything. Dilhonhi. But really, the Torah belongs to the Babylonians. They really have, and Rav Kahana basically proved that. He basically is used as the example that the Babylonians really have the way of the Torah. And obviously, this is in the Bavli, because the Bavli is trying to show the greatness of the rabbis of Babylonia over the rabbis of Israel. There's always this tension in the Gemaras about this kind of thing. Okay, a fascinating story. There can be a lot to be said about this. We try to think about the connection this has to the Moser, of like passing someone else's stuff. I had some ideas about it, but they're eluding me at this very moment. But let me just think. Right. I think, first of all, there's this idea of things seeming, again, this doesn't really have to relate to the Moser issue, but I think what the real theme of this story is seeing something that things appearing one way and not actually being that way. And that's, that's, maybe it's also a little bit of a, when you say they put me at gunpoint, like, was it really gunpoint? Were they really forcing you? That you can't always see what's under the surface. And that's something as a posek, when you go to rule in a case like this, you have to try to figure out what the circumstances are. And it's not always so easy to figure it out when not everything's laid out on the table for you. And here also, like, it wasn't so easy for Rabbi Yochanan to figure out who Rav Kahana was without having all the facts on the ground and understanding him better. Rav seemed to be the one who understood and foresaw exactly what was going to happen when he went there, but was unsuccessful in preventing the situation, because Rav Kahana was just too, it was too hard for him to really be quiet. Anyway, it's a lot. It's an interesting story. We're going to move on. So somebody showed the Gentiles the beautiful silk garments that Rabbi Abba's. Yativ showed it to Gentiles who were coming to steal things. It doesn't really say here whether it was onus or not, but we'll see. Yativ Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Chanina bar Papi, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka. So these three rabbis were judging. Yativ Rabbi Ila Gabai, when he was with them, this other rabbi. Several chiyuvei, he thought to make the person liable for giving over Rabbi Abba's silk stuff to this Gentile because it says, Tana Tadin, Zikat Chayav, Chayevet Zakai, Timeat Tator, V'Tieret Tameh, Masha Asa Soy V'Shalem Beito. So the Sosugi when we dealt with Garmi, which is the judges rule and they ruled the wrong way and they made someone pay, or they made something impure that was pure or impure, or pure that was impure. What they did, and they have to pay out of pocket. Okay, they have to be responsible for it and pay the money. So this guy should have to pay also. Amar lehu Rabbi Eli, Haki Amarav, Rabbi Eli says that's only if it's only liable if he did it biyad. It seems to be ruling by the rules of onus, as if the guy must have been forced, and that's why he said only if he actually gave it by hand. Amrilay, but he says, again, they don't really talk about onus, so it's not 100% clear. So basically, they wanted to rule that the guy is liable, but Rabbi Eli prevented them and said, it's not really true because he didn't really give it with his own hands. So Amrulay, so they said to him, listen, listen, we don't know how to rule on Garmi, but I do know that there's other rabbis that hold very strongly by Garmi and they're willing to make people liable. So go to him and you'll get your money back. Go to those rabbis. And what did they say? They said, based on our Mishnah, which makes it seem like this wasn't really an onus case, right, so what did they say? If because of the Gazlan comes to town, you have to give him a new field. So, right, that means you're liable. And that's when where you just showed someone and we can make you liable. And that's the law of Garmi. And therefore, they made him pay back. There was a guy who was given a silver goblet to watch of someone's. Thieves came to the guy's house. So he had in his house, besides his own stuff, he had this silver goblet of someone else's. So he gave it to them. He went before Rabba Patre and he said, you're exempt. Amar le Abaye, Abaye says, and we're going to see Abaye says this a few times in a few cases, that's unfair. He's saving himself using someone else's money. You should have given him his own stuff. Rav Ashi says whether or not this guy's going to be responsible is really going to depend. If he's a wealthy person, then the thieves must have come for him, and therefore they wanted his stuff, and the fact that he gave someone else's stuff, that's really unfair. And therefore he should pay the guy back. But if the guy's not a wealthy guy, they must have been coming for this silver goblet that they knew this person had. And therefore, it was okay that he gave him and he's not liable because he had no choice. This is a very interesting story. They had the money for Pidyon Shvuyim stored at his house. Okay, so they collected money to redeem hostages. Okay, something fortunately very relevant. Sliku gan ve'ilave. So what happens? The Ganavim come into his house. So he says, oh, I got this bag of money. We collected for Pidyon Shvuyim. I'll give it to them. But this seems a little unfair. That was public funds. What was he doing giving it? But the Gemara is going to say something interesting. Or Rava. So they go before Rava, or the community comes and says, hey, this was money we collected. And Rava says, oh, he's exempt. Abaye again is going to say, but he used money that belonged to other people to save it himself. Seems inappropriate. And we know that you're not allowed to do that. They have a great line. They said, what is this if not Pidyon Shvuyim? This is Pidyon Shvuyim. They collected money in the community to protect hostages. Well, this guy was going to be taken hostage if he didn't give them it. And therefore, it's actually a good use of hostage money. Fascinating. Okay, there's two different versions here. Our version that Gemara has says there was a person who put his donkey on the ferry that was going from one side of the river to the other before anyone else got on the ferry. Then people got on the ferry. Okay, in the other version, it's actually he put on the donkey after everyone was on the boat. And it's very important nafkamina, practical ramification of this difference. You'll see from the story. Well, the boat started drowning. So one of the people on the boat takes the donkey, it wasn't his donkey, throws it off to save everybody. And the donkey obviously drowns. So the owner of the donkey brings him before Rabbi. He says, I want my money back. Patre, he says the guy's exempt. So again, he was saving himself from using someone else's money. He says, what are you talking about? This guy who brought his donkey on the ferry was a rodef. Now, this is where it comes into significance, whether he was doing it, he was a rodef. He put the donkey on first before anyone got on. Even then, you can call him a rodef, or only if he put the donkey on after the people were already on. But either which way, we're going to say, right, and that's, you're going to have to read it one way or the other, but our version seems to say, even if he put the donkey on first, once people got on the boat, his donkey was basically risking everybody's life. So he's called a rodef. And therefore, yes, you can save the rodef, right? If someone wants to save someone who's trying to kill other people or trying to kill them, they're allowed to destroy the person's items. Okay, that's what we're going to see right now. And Rabba goes according to his own opinion, because it says here, the beginning is not going to be relevant, the continuation is, there's someone trying to chase someone else to kill them. And he breaks vessels on the way while he's chasing down someone to kill. This reminds me of all these action movies where as one guy's chasing the other, right, they're basically destroying a million things on the way. Whether they destroy the object of the person they're trying to kill, or they destroy items that belong to somebody else, patur, they're exempt. Why? Now you might think that's crazy. But again, this goes back to Kim Leibed when you're going to kill somebody, you're actually a dead man. Okay? When you're trying to kill someone else, you have like an onish mavet on your head. It's interesting because we'll get to this in Sanhedrin, but there's different ways to understand why you can kill a rodef. Is it just self-defense? Or is it that the person is actually deserving the death penalty? So you're killing someone who should anyway be killed by the court. This seems to show it's anyone who could be killed by the court, because we're using the fact that someone could kill you as actually calling you mitchayev benafsho. When it's kimle, kimle is a punishment by the court. Court instituted punishment. Since the court is instituting one punishment, they can't institute another. Here it's not exactly a punishment. It's the fact that people are allowed to kill you. But that is called here mitchayev benafsho because they view it as people can actually operate as the court. Because if you wait for the court, it'll be too late and they'll have already killed you. So anyway, that's the whole thing we'll get into in Sanhedrin if you didn't follow all that. But Nirdaf sheshiber. So therefore, since they're liable the death penalty while they're trying to kill you, therefore you're allowed to. Therefore, if they break vessels on the way, they don't need to pay because they're liable the death penalty at that moment. V'nirdaf, and someone who's being chased, like this guy on the boat who was going to die, sheshiber takelim shel rodef patur. If you kill the rodef's vessels, then you're exempt. So here, that's what he did: kill the rodef's kamor, and who was actually the rodef himself. Really, he's exempt. Shelo yehem mamono chaviv alav mikufo, because your money shouldn't be more valuable to you than your life. If you're allowed to kill the guy's life, then obviously you can destroy his property. Aval shel kol adam chayav. You can't just throw anyone else's property. But while you're running away from getting killed, if you break someone else's stuff, you actually are responsible for it. And this is what Abaye keeps saying: you can't save yourself by damaging someone else's property. And you might be able to do that, but you have to compensate them. Okay, there was a rodef who was chasing a rodef. In other words, it was the person who was, let's say, someone was trying to kill you, and then another person comes in and tries to kill the person who's killing you. Well, that person, since they're not the ones being chased, they can break anything they want. This is where I think of those action films of, trying to catch the bad guys. Well, Loman Hadin, who it's not really by law. It's just not by law. It's just that if you don't say that, then there's no one who's ever going to try to help someone who's in danger, because if you say you're going to be liable for any damages you cause, well, then you just won't do it, because then you're going to actually incur all sorts of expenses. Okay, new Mishnah. Shtafa nahal. Okay, now we get to a case where you steal someone's field and then it gets overrun by a river and ruined. You could say, listen, here, take your field back. Because, what did we learn? Karka in an exelet. Remember, the land is always considered in the ownership of the original owner. So basically, this land is their land the whole time. So you don't have to return. Usually we say, right, if you claim, right, that was the whole thing. You acquire it when you steal it, well, then you have to pay the value it was at the time of the theft. This is not the case because karka is in an exelet. Well, now we're going to see a braita with the machloket about this. Tana Rabbanit, gozel sadeh mechavero shtefanahu, same case. Chayav lamid lo sadeh achir, you have to give him a new field to Rabbi Eliezer. It says Rabbi Eliezer, it should be Rabbi Eliezer. Chachamim omrim haresh omer lo haresh achal fanecha. No, you could just return it as is. But Rabbi Eliezer says you have to give him the value it was when you stole it. B'may kamiflige. What's the root of their machloket? So we're now going to see the root of their machloket in simple terms is karka exelet or not? Rabbi Eliezer is going to say land is like metaltalim. It basically means you acquire it at the moment you steal it, in which case you have to return it at the value it was then. So if it now is destroyed, you have to return it at the original value. But where does he get to that? Well, Rabbi Eliezer darish riboy umiute, which is always a more inclusive kind of drasha. And we're going to see the rabbis darshan klal prat. So let's go. We're based on this pasuk that we've seen many times. Because we're at the end of class, I'm not going to read it, but you can look at it inside. But chichesh ba'amito, that's a general. He denies a claim, riba. Bipikadon, and something he was watching, that's already mi'et, that's limiting. Anything that you swear falsely about, chazar riba, that's already a general. Riba mi'et, riba hakol. So once you have a riboy, riboy, and if we're going to read the psukim in that kind of lens of these drashot, we're going to include everything. So, my Rabbi kol mile. So we're going to include everything. Well, obviously, if there's mute, it's going to mean we're going to have to exclude something. Well, we'll exclude something minor. My mi'et shtarot. We're going to say, well, not documents, because remember, documents have no inherent value. They're just symbolic. But land that has inherent value is going to be like metaltalim. And that's how Rabbi Eliezer gets his approach. Rabbanan darshe klal yuprat v'chichesh klal b'pikadon prat o mikol chazar kalal takes the same words except he uses other ones at the end or mikol, which is makol asher shava alav l'sheker. It's the same words we saw before. That's he's going to call it though klal upratu klal yatadan elakena prat has to be similar to the detail. Well, ma prat davar mitaltel v'gufo mamon. Pikadon is something that's movable and it has inherent value. Which is there to exclude yatsu karkaot and not land, and yatsu avadim shukshu karkaot, and yatsu shtarot, right? So no land, and slaves are like land, no slaves, and yatsu shtarot afa pishametaltlin en gufan mam. Okay, and those are not mam. We're going to stop here for today. We'll finish this up next class, where we're going to actually raise a question: is this really what they disagree about? But right now we think that their debate is, and we'll see later whether this is really holds true or not. Is karka exelet or no? Okay, quick review of our daf, really quick. What we really have with a lot of cases of moser. Okay, we started with what's the relevance of knas, the knas you can't learn from. We tried to bring to proofs. We weren't successful. Then we went into a lot of different cases of someone who's moser. We talked about if it's ones, that's different from if it was done not be'ones, without gunpoint, without them forcing you. You just kind of went on your own. Even within ones, if you actually give it by hand, but then we had some modifications of that. We got into the story, the famous story of Rav Kahana when he gets to Rabbi Yochanan in Israel and how impressive he is. But on the other hand, he also gets himself killed and brought back to life. Crazy story. And then we had some more cases of passing on things. And then we ended with this case of land, and is land acquired or not by theft. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day. B'sorot tovot.